Keanu Reeves walks into an upscale restaurant in the heart of the city, dressed in simple, wrinkled clothes, looking as though he had just come from an ordinary day. Without drawing attention to himself, he quietly selects a discreet table, blending into the luxurious surroundings where crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow. Before he even has a chance to place his order, a waitress strides over, her expression filled with disdain and an unmistakable air of arrogance. She crosses her arms, tilts her head, and with a sarcastic smirk snaps, "Are you sure you can afford to be here?" Her words drip with irony, loud enough for nearby diners to overhear. A few guests glance over, intrigued by the confrontation. What happens next will not only leave everyone in the restaurant speechless, but will reveal a truth that changes everything. Everyone in the restaurant stunned, but it also reveals a truth that will change everything. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow at 12:30 p.m., we have another special story waiting for you. The Lumiere restaurant was the epitome of sophistication, located on one of the most prestigious avenues in Beverly Hills. Its expansive windows framed a view of the bustling streets, adorned with luxurious neon signs and slow-moving sports cars gliding past in a symphony of wealth and style. Inside, every detail was meticulously curated to impress. From the gleaming marble floors to the intricate gold accents that lined the walls. Lumiere wasn't just a restaurant, it was a destination for those who wanted to see and be seen. Impress. Lumiere wasn't just a restaurant, it was a stage for the city's elite, a place where people went to be seen and admired. Among the staff was Ashley Bennett, one of Lumiere's most experienced waitresses. She moved confidently through the dining room, her every step practiced and deliberate, accompanied by a rehearsed smile. Her immaculate bun and perfectly tailored uniform projected an image of efficiency and control. To Ashley, working at Lumiere wasn't just a job, it was a privilege, a badge of honor she never hesitated to boast about whenever the opportunity arose. But beneath her polished exterior was a less flattering side. Ashley's pride often spilled over into arrogance, and she had a knack for sizing people up in an instant, mentally categorizing them based on their appearance, demeanor, and clothing. To her, Lumiere wasn't just a restaurant. It was a place for people who fit the part. And for those who didn't, in her mind, they simply didn't belong. Had another side, an exaggerated pride that often spilled over into outright arrogance. Ashley had a peculiar talent for quickly judging patrons, mentally categorizing them based on their clothing, demeanor, and overall appearance. "Some people just don't belong here," she often thought to herself as she moved through the opulent dining room, the reception desk. Keanu Reeves wasn't a man who enjoyed flaunting his wealth. Despite being one of Hollywood's most well-known stars, his reserved demeanor stood in stark contrast to the glitzy, extravagant sparkle of Beverly Hills. At that moment, he appeared to be just another ordinary customer, blending into the background with an air of quiet simplicity. Ashley, busy at the reception desk discussing a VIP reservation with another staff member, caught sight of Keanu out of the corner of her eye. She abruptly stopped mid-conversation, her gaze narrowing as she assessed him with barely concealed disdain. To her, he didn't look anything like the typical Lumiere clientele. The restaurant's glass door swung open smoothly, and a man walked in. He wore worn-out jeans, a plain shirt, and a jacket that looked comfortable but bore no trace of luxury branding. His presence was understated, almost invisible in the sea of extravagance, as he calmly made his way to the reception desk. Typical Lumiere clientele. Without hiding her reaction, Ashley tilted her head, giving Keanu a slow, deliberate once-over. Her eyes lingered on his scuffed boots, her expression growing more skeptical by the second. "Good evening," she said in a dry tone, forcing a smile that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. "How can I help you?" "I'd like a table, please," Keanu replied, his tone polite and calm, showing no reaction to her obvious judgment. Ashley raised an eyebrow, as if she had just heard something absurd. Her expression practically screamed, "How dare he!" Crossing her arms, she let the smile drop entirely. "Are you sure you're in the right place? This is a very exclusive restaurant," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Exclusive restaurant." Keanu continued to smile, completely unfazed. "Yes, this is the place," he replied calmly, his tone steady and polite. Ashley let out a short, incredulous laugh, shaking her head as if the situation were some sort of joke. "Okay, just a moment. I need to check something," she said curtly, spinning on her heels and heading toward the reception office, without bothering to maintain even a semblance of politeness. Once inside, Ashley accessed the reservation system, typing his name with exaggerated flair, her fingers striking the keys almost theatrically. When nothing came up, she rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath, and made her way back to the dining area, visibly annoyed. "Well, as I suspected," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You don't have a reservation." Dripping with sarcasm. "We do have a few tables available, but just so you know, this isn't a casual dining spot." Keanu remained unbothered, his calm demeanor seemingly irritating Ashley even more. "I'd like to dine here," he replied, his tone steady and unchanged. Ashley let out an exaggerated sigh, grabbing a menu with an abrupt motion. "All right, but I'll need to seat you in a suitable area." "Follow me," she said, her voice laced with thinly veiled annoyance. She began walking briskly through the dining room, not bothering to glance back to ensure he was following. When they reached the farthest, least appealing corner of the restaurant, a dimly lit table near the kitchen where the sound of clattering dishes and staff chatter filled the air, she stopped. Of the restaurant, she dropped the menu on the table with an audible thud. "Here you go. This table is perfect for you," she said in a falsely sweet tone, her voice practically dripping with mockery. "If you need anything, let me know, but only if it's necessary, okay?" Keanu maintained his slight smile, completely ignoring the condescending tone. "Thank you. I'm sure this will be an interesting experience," he replied calmly. As Ashley walked away, she muttered under her breath, loud enough for a nearby couple to hear. "He won't last 5 minutes here. Bet he'll leave as soon as he opens the menu." Across the dining room, Keanu sat quietly, opening the menu with an air of tranquility. He scanned the options without haste, his serene demeanor in stark contrast to the opulence and tension around him. Opened the menu, his eyes scanning the options without haste. The gentle sounds of live piano music continued to fill the air, creating a refined ambiance. Yet something about Keanu's posture was captivating, as if nothing in the world could disturb his sense of serenity. From the other side of the room, Ashley watched him with a smug smile, certain that he would soon ask for the check and leave in embarrassment. She was already picturing it in her mind, the man realizing he didn't belong in such an upscale establishment and slipping out quietly. Earlier, when she led Keanu through the dining room, her steps had been brisk and mechanical, devoid of any courtesy. Rather than selecting a table in the center of the room, where golden light from the chandeliers illuminated the elegance of the space, she had deliberately chosen a corner near the kitchen, a place that felt disconnected from the grandeur of the restaurant. It was her not-so-subtle way of emphasizing her judgment. Environment. She led him to the most hidden and poorly lit corner of the restaurant, a table near the kitchen, where the clatter of dishes being washed and the muffled chatter of staff created an atmosphere worlds apart from the elegance of the main dining room. "Here you go. This table should do," she said, dropping the menu carelessly onto the table. Her tone was laced with mockery as she added, "I think you'll feel comfortable here. It's more private." Keanu glanced at the table, then back at Ashley. His slight smile remained unwavering. "Thank you," he replied calmly, his tone betraying no hint of irritation. Ashley crossed her arms and narrowed her eyes, as if trying to determine whether he was being sarcastic or genuinely oblivious. "You're welcome," she said, with a sarcastic edge, her fake politeness barely masking her disdain. Without waiting for his response, she turned on her heels and walked away, leaving him alone in the uninviting corner. Eyes, as if trying to figure out whether he was being sarcastic or simply clueless. "You're welcome," she replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Just so you know, we usually reserve these tables for special cases. But since we don't have anything booked tonight, you can have it." Spinning on her heels, Ashley walked away briskly, not giving Keanu a chance to respond. Her smug satisfaction was clear as she disappeared into the main dining room, leaving him in the shadowy corner. When Ashley finally returned to his table to take his order, her behavior became even more pointedly cruel. She pulled out her notepad with an exaggerated motion, making sure to draw attention to herself. Casting a cold, judgmental glance at Keanu, she asked, "Have you decided what you'd like?" Her tone was curt, and the boredom in her voice was impossible to miss, bothering to hide the boredom in her voice. "Or would you like a recommendation?" she added, her tone dripping with mockery. Keanu glanced at the menu, his expression serene, and calmly pointed to one of the most expensive main courses. "I'd like to try this one," he said. Ashley stifled a laugh, covering her mouth with one hand as though holding back a snide comment. "Oh, of course, the filet de Rossini," she replied with a condescending tone. "A classic dish. Just to confirm, sir, you do know this costs $350, right?" Keanu nodded, his calm demeanor unchanging. "Yes, it sounds wonderful," he replied simply. Ashley tilted her head, her lips curling into a malicious smile. "All right then," she said, her voice filled with exaggerated politeness. "Just to make sure there aren't any misunderstandings later, I suggest you double-check the prices. We wouldn't want any unpleasant surprises." Keanu's serene expression didn't falter. "I'm certain," he said, his voice steady. Ashley let out a dramatic sigh, jotting down the order with exaggerated movements. "Very well. As you wish," she said, her tone as sharp as ever. "But I'll warn you, our chef prefers dishes like this to be enjoyed by those who truly appreciate fine dining. I hope it meets your expectations." She spun on her heels again, leaving Keanu alone at the table, her lips curling into a malicious smile. "All right then. Just to make sure there aren't any misunderstandings later, I suggest you double-check the prices. We wouldn't want any unpleasant surprises." Keanu remained unfazed, his calm demeanor irritating her even more. "I'm certain," he said calmly, his voice steady and polite. Ashley let out a dramatic sigh, as if she were doing him the biggest favor of her day. She jotted down the order with an exaggerated motion, her attitude making it clear she didn't expect this to end well. "Very well, as you wish," she said, her tone sharp with condescension. "But I'll warn you," she continued, leaning slightly closer as though sharing an insider's tip. "Our chef prefers dishes like this to be enjoyed by those who truly appreciate fine dining. I hope it meets your expectations." Keanu's serene expression didn't change. "Thank you," he replied, unfazed as always. Ashley, visibly annoyed by his lack of reaction, spun on her heels and walked away, muttering something under her breath as she headed toward the kitchen. Expectations. She spun on her heels again, but before leaving she stopped and turned back, adding with a sarcastic smirk, "Oh, and one more thing. The minimum tip expected here is 20%. Keep that in mind while you enjoy." Keanu remained calm, entirely unaffected by the discomfort Ashley was so clearly trying to create. As he waited, he glanced around the dining room, taking in the elegant decor and the soothing performance of the pianist. His serene demeanor stood in stark contrast to the tension Ashley was attempting to provoke. When the appetizer finally arrived, Ashley approached the table with a forced smile. She set the plate down with an unnecessary amount of force, causing it to slide slightly across the table. "Here's your appetizer," she said, her tone mocking. "I hope you enjoy it, or at least know what you're eating." Keanu looked at her, his slight smile unwavering, and replied, "Thank you." His calmness seemed to annoy her even more as she turned and walked away, muttering under her breath, with a mocking smile. But Keanu, ever polite, responded with a calm, "Thank you." Ashley, clearly irritated by his unwavering composure, leaned in slightly as if to provoke a reaction. "You know," she said in a condescending tone, "a lot of customers who order this dish end up not liking it. It's not exactly mainstream, but I think you'll do just fine. Good luck." Keanu looked at her with the same calm expression as always and replied, "It looks excellent. Thank you for your attention." Frustrated that she still couldn't elicit any negative reaction from him, Ashley huffed quietly and walked away quickly, muttering to a coworker as she passed, "That guy won't even make it to the main course." Meanwhile, Keanu remained seated, serene and unbothered, as if Ashley's words and actions didn't affect him in the slightest. His quiet confidence seemed to highlight the contrast between their behavior even more. The main course. "He's going to ask for the check as soon as he sees the bill," Ashley muttered to herself, her tone dripping with satisfaction. Meanwhile, Keanu continued to eat his appetizer leisurely, entirely unaffected by her attitude. His calm, deliberate movements conveyed a quiet confidence, as though nothing could disrupt his peace. From across the dining room, Ashley stood watching him with her arms crossed, a malicious smile spreading across her face. "I bet he's going to ask for tap water," she said to another staff member nearby. "These types always do." Her coworker, clearly uncomfortable, avoided responding and instead busied himself with organizing silverware. However, the elderly customer seated at a nearby table had been observing everything quietly. As Keanu ate, the older gentleman raised his wine glass subtly in Keanu's direction, a quiet toast of respect. Keanu noticed, offering a slight nod and a polite smile in return. The moment passed between them silently, unnoticed by Ashley, whose attention remained focused on her attempts to belittle Keanu. Little did she know, her behavior wasn't going unnoticed by the other diners, who were beginning to take note of the growing tension. R silently toasts in Keanu's direction. Keanu notices and responds with a slight nod and a calm smile, his demeanor remaining serene. Dinner is only just beginning, but Ashley's growing disdain for Keanu won't go unnoticed for much longer. Her contempt continues to escalate, and her actions become even more deliberate. After taking Keanu's order, Ashley decides to teach a lesson to the customer she believes has no right to be dining at Lumiere. Instead of promptly delivering his order to the kitchen, she makes a point of prioritizing patrons she deems more important. She stops to chat with an elegant couple seated in the center of the dining room, her laughter exaggerated and loud as they share a joke. She even takes the time to deliver a cocktail to a table that isn't hers, making sure to project an air of importance as she interacts with the wealthier clientele. Meanwhile, time ticks by, and Keanu remains at his table waiting patiently. His composed presence only amplifies the stark contrast between his quiet dignity and Ashley's overt disdain. Other diners begin to notice her behavior, their disapproving glances signaling that her actions are far from unnoticed. Guessed, and even delivered a cocktail to a table that wasn't hers. Meanwhile, time passed, and Keanu continued to wait patiently. His calm demeanor remained unshaken, despite Ashley's repeated attempts to provoke him. She deliberately walked past his table multiple times, pretending to be busy. Each time Keanu glanced in her direction, she quickly averted her eyes and picked up her pace, as if she were far too occupied to attend to him. After a long wait, one of the patrons who had been quietly observing the situation decided to intervene. The elderly man, with neatly combed white hair and dressed in an impeccably tailored navy blue suit, approached Keanu's table with a kind smile. "Good evening, young man," he said politely, his voice soft yet firm. "I hope you don't mind me interrupting, but I've noticed that you've been overlooked." Keanu looked up, meeting the man's kind eyes, and smiled back calmly. "Good evening," he replied. "Don't worry, it's all fine." The elderly man chuckled softly, leaning in slightly to speak more quietly. "You know, sometimes being treated like this is a test of our patience. But I can say with certainty, maintaining your composure is a great sign of strength." Before Keanu could respond, Ashley appeared suddenly, interrupting the exchange. Her tone was polished, but there was a subtle edge of authority. "Sir, can I help you with something?" she asked the elderly man. "I wouldn't want you to disturb our customer." Approached with a kind smile. "Good evening, young man. I hope you don't mind me interrupting, but I've noticed that you've been overlooked," he said, his tone polite yet firm. Keanu looked up, meeting the man's kind eyes, and smiled back calmly. "Good evening. Don't worry, it's all fine," he replied, his voice as steady as ever. The elderly man chuckled softly, leaning in slightly to speak more quietly. "You know," he began, "sometimes being treated like this is a test of our patience. But I can say with certainty that maintaining your composure is a great sign of strength." Before Keanu could reply, Ashley suddenly appeared, her presence cutting into the conversation. "Sir, can I help you with something?" she asked, her tone more polished than usual but carrying a subtly authoritative edge. "I wouldn't want you to disturb our customer," she added, her gaze briefly flicking to Keanu before returning to the elderly man. The elderly man straightened slightly, narrowing his eyes at her but maintaining his composure. "Don't worry, miss. I was just greeting this gentleman here. It's rare to find someone so serene," he said, his tone still polite but laced with a quiet rebuke. "Sir, can I help you with something?" Ashley asked the elderly man, her voice more polished than usual but carrying a subtly authoritative tone. "I wouldn't want you to disturb our customer." The elderly man narrowed his eyes at her, his expression calm but pointed. Still, he maintained his composure. "Don't worry, miss. I was just greeting this gentleman here. It's rare to find someone so serene," he replied, his words carrying an undertone of quiet disapproval. Ashley let out an exaggerated sigh, clearly impatient. She gestured toward the man's table with an abrupt motion. "Well, perhaps you should return to your table and enjoy your dinner," she said, her tone barely hiding her annoyance. Keanu simply observed the exchange, his calm expression unchanging. He offered a small, polite nod to the elderly man. "Thank you for coming over. It was a pleasure speaking with you," Keanu said, his voice steady and kind. The elderly man nodded in return, casting one final look of disapproval toward Ashley before walking back to his table. Ashley, meanwhile, appeared entirely indifferent, as if the moment didn't faze her at all. The interaction, his expression calm, yet analytical. "Thank you for coming over," he said to the elderly man with a slight nod. "It was a pleasure speaking with you." The elderly man nodded and returned to his table, but not before casting one final look of disapproval at Ashley, who stood nearby, appearing entirely indifferent to his judgment. When Ashley finally decided to bring Keanu's main course, she deliberately took longer than necessary. First, she stopped in the kitchen to chat casually with the chefs, leaving the dish sitting under the warming lamp for far longer than needed. Then, instead of delivering the food promptly, she returned to the dining room to attend to another table, laughing exaggeratedly at a joke one of the patrons told. All the while, Keanu remained seated, waiting patiently, as though completely unaware of her tactics. Finally, after an extended delay, Ashley made her way toward Keanu's table, carrying the dish with an air of feigned politeness. But her true intentions were clear in the way she approached. To the dining room to attend another table, completely ignoring the ready plate. She laughed with a group of guests, lingering unnecessarily while Keanu's dish sat waiting. When she finally brought the dish out, she placed it on Keanu's table with a brusque gesture, causing the silverware to rattle slightly. "Here's your order. I hope you enjoy it," she said, her tone dripping with irony. Then, with a mocking smirk, she added, "Oh, and if you don't like it, please let us know. We can always adjust to something more affordable." Keanu looked at her, his expression unbothered, and thanked her with the same calm demeanor as before. "It looks excellent. Thank you," he replied simply, his voice steady and polite. Ashley gave a cynical smile, clearly irritated by his composed response. Leaning in slightly, she lowered her voice just enough for him to hear her next words clearly. "Are you sure? This is a very sophisticated dish. It might be difficult for someone who's not used to it. Are you sure? It's a very sophisticated dish. It might be difficult for someone who's not used to it, Ashley said, her voice dripping with condescension. I'm sure, Keanu replied serenely, his calm tone unwavering. Thank you for your concern. Frustrated that she still couldn't provoke any reaction from him, Ashley walked away quickly, her annoyance barely concealed. At the bar, Ashley couldn't help but vent to a coworker who was clearly trying to ignore her remarks. He's pretending to be polite, but it's obvious he's uncomfortable, she said with a laugh, placing an empty glass on the counter. I bet he doesn't even know what he's eating. It's always the same with these types. They come in here trying to act like they belong, but they just end up embarrassing themselves. Her coworker forced a polite smile, visibly uncomfortable with her comments, but not saying anything. Meanwhile, Ashley continued to revel in her perceived superiority, oblivious to the growing unease among the other staff and patrons. These types, Ashley continued, shaking her head with a smug grin. They come here to feel important, but just end up making fools of themselves. Her coworker forced a polite smile, clearly uncomfortable with her remarks. Maybe he just wants to have dinner, Ashley. Maybe we should treat him like any other customer, he suggested cautiously. Ashley stared at him incredulously, as if he had just said something absurd. Like any other customer? Did you see the boots he's wearing? She scoffed. He doesn't belong here. And frankly, if he can't handle it, he shouldn't have even walked through the door. Meanwhile, the couple who had been observing the scene earlier exchanged whispers. She's awful, the woman said, shaking her head in disapproval. I agree, the man replied, his frown deepening. He's being so polite, and she's just trying to humiliate him. The growing discontent among the other patrons was becoming increasingly evident. While Ashley remained oblivious to the judgmental stares, her actions were now starting to shift the atmosphere in the restaurant. The woman said, shaking her head. He's being so polite, but she keeps trying to humiliate him. I agree, the man frowned. It's disgraceful. I think we should say something to the manager. Back at his table, Keanu calmly finished his main course. He glanced around briefly, noticing the sympathetic looks from other patrons, but he didn't appear the least bit bothered. His serene demeanor remained intact, as though Ashley's behavior hadn't fazed him at all. When Ashley returned to clear his plate, her expression was still filled with disdain, though she attempted to mask it with a fake smile. So how was the dish? Did it meet your expectations? She asked, her tone heavy with insincerity. Keanu looked her straight in the eye, his calm gaze steady. It was excellent, he replied simply. Thank you. Please tell the chefs they did an impeccable job. Ashley raised her eyebrows slightly, surprised by his response. For a moment, she seemed at a loss for words, her usual sarcastic remarks failing her. But as she turned to walk away, she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for nearby patrons to hear. He might be smiling now, but let's see if he still is when the bill comes. Eyes and replied, It was excellent. Thank you. Please tell the chefs they did an impeccable job. Ashley raised her eyebrows, momentarily caught off guard. She hadn't expected him to respond so positively, especially after all her efforts to provoke him. Frustrated that she couldn't elicit any complaints or irritation, she turned and walked away. But as she did, she muttered under her breath, loud enough for nearby patrons to hear. He might be smiling now, but let's see if he still is when the bill comes. Seated at the table, Keanu remained calm, observing the dining room with a slight smile on his face. His gaze was steady and deliberate, suggesting that the moment to act was drawing ever closer. Ashley, increasingly frustrated by her inability to provoke any reaction from Keanu, decided to escalate her efforts. She walked to the bar, loudly gossiping with a coworker, and glancing toward Keanu's table as if to ensure he was aware of her disdain. Her petty attempts to maintain control of the situation were becoming more obvious to the other diners, many of whom now watched her behavior with disapproval. Provocations. After serving Keanu the coffee he had requested, Ashley deliberately spoke loudly enough for several nearby tables to hear. "You know, it's hard to maintain standards when just anyone thinks they can walk in," she said to a colleague, her tone dripping with mockery as she cast a pointed glance in Keanu's direction. The colleague, visibly uncomfortable, tried to change the subject. "Maybe we should just focus on our work, Ashley," he said quietly, attempting to steer the conversation away. But Ashley wasn't finished. "That's why we have a reservations policy," she continued, her voice laced with arrogance. "It helps us avoid situations like this." Several patrons nearby began paying closer attention to her words. Some frowned in disapproval, while others whispered among themselves. The murmurs grew louder as more diners noticed the growing tension. At one table, the couple who had been observing earlier shook their heads. "She's completely out of line," the woman whispered. "It's disgraceful," the man added, his voice tinged with frustration. "How can she treat someone like that?" Even the elderly man seated nearby looked on with a deepening frown, quietly observing as Ashley continued her unprofessional behavior, oblivious to the shifting atmosphere around her. Meanwhile, Keanu remained composed, sipping his coffee as though none of this was happening. His serene demeanor only heightened the contrast between him and Ashley's escalating arrogance. Themselves. The couple who had been following the situation looked visibly outraged. The woman placed her hand on her chest, murmuring, "This is outrageous. She's trying to humiliate the man in public." At another table, the elderly man took a sip of his wine, his sharp gaze fixed on the unfolding scene. His expression reflected his growing disapproval as he muttered under his breath, "This has gone too far." Keanu, still seated calmly at his table, continued to survey the room without a hint of irritation. His serene demeanor remained intact, a quiet but powerful contrast to the escalating tension. Ashley, however, was beginning to feel the weight of the other patrons' judgment. The once confident waitress now felt the subtle stares directed at her from all around the room. Her composure faltered slightly, but she tried to shake it off, her determination to provoke Keanu only growing stronger. But her behavior wasn't having the desired effect. Instead, Keanu's unshakable calm seemed to unsettle her even more, magnifying her discomfort as the eyes of the restaurant turned against her. A well-dressed woman seated 2 tables ahead leaned toward her companion and whispered, "He must be someone important to stay this calm. Anyone else would have left by now." "Or maybe he's just stronger than she realizes," the man replied, casting a curious glance at Keanu, his calm demeanor continuing to intrigue the onlookers. Determined to provoke a reaction, Ashley returned to Keanu's table, but her approach was far from professional. She plastered an exaggeratedly sarcastic smile on her face and leaned slightly toward him. "I hope you're enjoying your experience," she said, her tone dripping with mock politeness. "After all, it's always interesting to have different kinds of people here. It adds such a unique touch to the atmosphere," she added, her words laden with thinly veiled condescension. Keanu looked up at her, his expression calm but firm, as if weighing her words carefully. The room grew quieter as nearby diners strained to catch the interaction, their disapproval of Ashley's behavior growing more evident. "Different kinds of people here. It adds a unique touch to the atmosphere," Ashley said with a smirk, her condescension thinly veiled. Keanu fixed her with a steady gaze, his calm expression unchanging, but his tone carrying weight. "Different? Could you explain what you mean by that?" he asked evenly. Ashley let out a short, nervous laugh, clearly caught off guard but trying to maintain her composure. "Oh, don't take it the wrong way," she said quickly, her smile faltering. "It's just that, well, our clientele typically has a more traditional profile. It's rare to see someone with your style here." The room fell silent. Nearby diners stopped their conversations entirely, their attention now focused on the interaction. Ashley, now aware of the growing audience, glanced around but struggled to hide her discomfort. Her confident facade was beginning to crack as she realized the situation was no longer under her control. Keanu, however, remained calm and composed, his steady gaze making her shift uneasily. Seemed pleased with the attention she was receiving, convinced she had the situation under control. Keanu stayed silent for a few moments, holding her gaze. His expression was firm yet devoid of anger, his composure unnerving. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm and deliberate. "You're right. Perhaps I should handle this differently." Ashley blinked, momentarily confused by his response. Before she could say anything, the restaurant manager entered the dining room. A middle-aged man with impeccable posture and an air of authority, he scanned the room, instantly sensing the tense atmosphere. When his eyes landed on Keanu, his expression shifted drastically, from professional neutrality to recognition and alarm. The manager hurried toward the table, ignoring Ashley entirely, his demeanor becoming one of deference. The room grew even quieter as patrons watched, curious about what was unfolding. Expression changed drastically. He hurried over to the table, completely ignoring Ashley. "Mr. Reeves," the manager exclaimed, his tone filled with respect and urgency. "I wasn't aware you were visiting us today. Please let me know how I can assist you." Ashley's face turned pale, the blood draining as she watched the scene unfold. Her confident facade crumbled as she glanced back and forth between the manager and Keanu, utterly bewildered. Keanu held the manager's gaze for a moment, offering a small, polite nod. Then, he turned his attention back to Ashley. "Now," he said, his tone calm but commanding, "let's talk about how we treat people." The entire dining room fell silent, every pair of eyes now fixed on the table. Ashley froze, her mind racing, but she couldn't find the words to respond. The gravity of the moment had shifted entirely, and it was clear to everyone that this was no ordinary customer. People. The silence in the room was deafening. All eyes were fixed on Keanu's table, waiting to see what would happen next. The manager of Lumiere, a man with an impeccable appearance and a commanding demeanor, appeared visibly shaken as he fully took in the situation. Ignoring Ashley entirely, he addressed Keanu directly, leaning slightly in a gesture of respect. "Mr. Reeves, I deeply apologize for the delay in recognizing you. It's an honor to have you with us this evening. Please let me know how I can make your experience more enjoyable," he said, his tone humble and deferential. Ashley stood frozen, her face pale as she stared at the exchange in disbelief. She glanced between Keanu and the manager, struggling to process what was happening. Her earlier arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by confusion and a growing sense of dread. Keanu looked at the manager, offering him a slight smile. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady and polite. Then, turning back to Ashley, he added, "But this isn't about me. This is about something much more important." The tension in the room was palpable, as patrons leaned in, eager to hear what Keanu would say next. The moment was charged with anticipation, as though everyone present knew they were about to witness something unforgettable. Tone filled with deference. Ashley, who up until that moment believed she was in control of the situation, froze. Her mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. "Mr. Reeves? He knows him? What's going on here?" Keanu looked at the manager, offering him a slight, reassuring smile. "Thank you, but there's no need to worry. I'm fine," he said calmly. "I'd just like to have a brief conversation with your staff, if that's not a problem." The manager's expression immediately grew concerned, sensing that something was amiss. "Of course, Mr. Reeves," he replied without hesitation. "Whatever you need." He cast a sharp, reproachful glance at Ashley, whose face had turned pale, her confident demeanor now completely shattered. The weight of the moment was clear, and the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Need. The manager cast a sharp, reproachful glance at Ashley, who stood beside them, pale and visibly uncomfortable. Ashley began stammering, her voice shaking as she desperately tried to regain some semblance of control. I didn't know. I thought The manager cut her off with firm resolve. Thought what, Ashley? That this customer, who happens to be one of the owners of this restaurant, didn't deserve the same respect as anyone else? His voice was low, but it carried a severity that drained the remaining color from Ashley's face. She froze, struggling to justify herself, but no words came out. Her mind raced for an explanation, yet she knew nothing she could say would undo the damage. I didn't realize he didn't say who he was. She trailed off weakly, her excuses faltering under the weight of the situation. The murmurs in the room grew louder as the other patrons watched the scene unfold, their disapproval of her behavior now unmistakable. Keanu stood quietly, observing, his calm demeanor emphasizing the gravity of the moment. Herself. He didn't say who he was, and he looked. She trailed off, realizing that anything she said would only make the situation worse. Keanu finally broke the silence, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that resonated throughout the room. There's no need to state who I am to be treated with dignity, he said, his gaze steady and unwavering. Frankly, it shouldn't matter. Everyone who walks through these doors, regardless of their appearance, should be welcomed with respect. The entire dining room was riveted. Many patrons murmured among themselves, stunned by the revelation and by Keanu's composed but impactful words. His statement carried a universal truth that struck a chord with everyone present. At one table, an elegantly dressed woman whispered to her companion, "He's absolutely right. It's shocking how she behaved." The manager nodded solemnly, clearly moved by Keanu's words. He turned to the rest of the staff, his tone firm but regretful. Let this be a lesson to all of us. What happened here today is not the standard we strive for at Lumiere, and it will not happen again. The weight of the moment lingered as the patrons continued to absorb what had unfolded, their respect for Keanu growing with each passing second. Ashley, meanwhile, stood frozen, realizing the full extent of her mistake, that Keanu was one of the restaurant's owners. The couple who had been following the interaction appeared pleased, their earlier frustration giving way to quiet satisfaction. The elderly man nodded discreetly in approval, his earlier observations now validated. Nearby tables buzzed with hushed conversation. A man seated with his wife leaned in and whispered, "I knew there was something different about him. He has a presence that's impossible to ignore." The woman nodded in agreement. "And look at how he's handling it, with such grace. I hope she learned something from this." Other diners exchanged murmurs, some clearly ashamed for not stepping in earlier. The revelation of Keanu's identity added a new layer of significance to the situation, but what resonated most was the quiet dignity he had maintained throughout the ordeal. His calm and measured response had left a lasting impression on everyone in the room, shifting the focus from Ashley's behavior to a powerful lesson in humility and respect. Earlier, the atmosphere in the dining room was tense, but there was a palpable sense of anticipation. Everyone wanted to see how this would end. The manager turned to Ashley again, his expression a mix of frustration and restraint. "Ashley, I expect a detailed explanation of your behavior after your shift," he said firmly. "For now, please leave this table and stay away from it. I'll take over from here." Ashley opened her mouth to protest, her instinct to defend herself kicking in, but the manager's resolute gaze silenced her. Realizing she had no choice, she closed her mouth and gave a stiff nod. With an abrupt motion, she turned and hurried away, avoiding the stares of the patrons around her. The judgmental eyes and quiet murmurs from the other diners seemed to weigh heavily on her as she disappeared into the kitchen. The tension in the room began to ease slightly, though the patrons remained riveted, eager to see how Keanu and the manager would handle the situation moving forward. The respect for Keanu among the diners was evident, and the impact of his composure and grace was unmistakable. Keanu took a deep breath and stood up. He glanced around the room, noticing that all eyes were fixed on him. With a calm tone imbued with authority, He began to speak. This restaurant was founded with the idea of being a place where everyone could feel welcome, no matter how they dress or where they come from. Unfortunately, that was not the case today. But I believe we can learn from this. The diners remained silent, their attention fully on him as they absorbed his words. The atmosphere was heavy with reflection, and even those who had previously been silent now seemed to feel the weight of what had transpired. The manager stood beside Keanu, his expression both uneasy and admiring of the way Keanu was handling the situation. It was clear that the humility and grace Keanu demonstrated had left an impression on everyone in the room. Keanu continued, "Respect and kindness should be the foundation of any space, especially one like this, where people gather to celebrate moments and create memories. It shouldn't matter who someone is, what they wear, or where they come from. Everyone deserves dignity." His words resonated deeply, and the room remained silent, a collective moment of introspection washing over the patrons and staff alike. Turned to the manager and concluded, "I'd like to meet with the entire team after the dining room closes. There are some important things we need to discuss." The manager nodded immediately, his tone filled with respect. "It will be done, Mr. Reeves. Once again, I apologize for everything." Keanu offered him a small, reassuring nod before returning to his seat. Gradually, the dining room began to return to normal, though the patrons continued to whisper about what they had just witnessed. The air still carried a sense of awe and reflection as Keanu's words and actions lingered in their minds. Later that evening, the empty Lumiere dining room stood silent. The staff, now gathered together, waited attentively as Keanu Reeves remained at the center, his presence commanding the space. His calm and composed demeanor remained, but his expression carried a purpose that demanded focus. Everyone stood quietly, awaiting his words, knowing this was not just a reprimand, but an opportunity for change. Looked around, his eyes meeting each person's, conveying a profound calm, but also an unwavering resolve. "We all make mistakes," he began, his voice steady and resonant. "But what truly matters is what we do after those mistakes. Today, we witnessed a problem that goes far beyond poor service. We saw the impact of snap judgments, hidden biases, and a lack of empathy. But I want you to understand, this is not a condemnation. It's an opportunity." Keanu paused, allowing his words to settle over the room. The staff remained silent, their expressions a mix of reflection and anticipation. His gaze lingered on Ashley, who sat at the back of the group, her eyes filled with tears and shame. Her confident facade was gone, replaced by genuine remorse. She kept her head slightly lowered, as if unable to meet Keanu's gaze fully. Keanu continued, his tone softening but retaining its purpose. "It's easy to judge someone based on what's on the surface, their clothes, their appearance, or how they present themselves. But when we do that, we miss the chance to truly see people for who they are. And sometimes, the kindness we choose to extend might just change someone's life, or even our own." The room remained silent, every word he spoke carrying weight and leaving a deep impression on those gathered. Ashley shifted uncomfortably, but didn't look away, as though she knew this moment was as much for her as it was for the rest of the team. Tears and shame. "Ashley," Keanu said, his tone gentle but firm, "I know what happened today was a mistake, and mistakes can be corrected, as long as there's effort and a willingness to learn. What you choose to do next will define who you are." Ashley nodded slowly, her expression a mix of remorse and reflection, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Keanu turned to the rest of the team, his voice softening but still retaining its purpose. "In the world we live in, it's all too easy to judge people based on what we see on the surface, their clothes, their appearance, what they drive, or where they live. But I want you to consider something important. What happens when you choose to look beyond the surface? What happens when you treat someone with kindness, even if they don't fit your expectations?" He paused, letting his words resonate. The staff remained silent, hanging on to every word, their expressions showing the impact of what he was saying. The choices we make, every small decision, define the character of a place like this, Keanu continued. And more importantly, they define us as individuals. When we choose kindness, empathy, and respect, we don't just elevate others, we elevate ourselves. The weight of his words settled over the room, and even those who had been distant observers now appeared deeply moved. To treat someone with kindness, when you decide to look beyond appearances and recognize another person's humanity. Keanu stepped forward, placing his hands in his pockets, his tone becoming more reflective. "We all carry struggles that no one else can see," he said, his voice soft but resonant. "The person who seems out of place might be having the worst day of their life. The one who doesn't dress as expected might have achieved more than you could imagine." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, ensuring his words reached every individual. The kindness we choose to extend, especially to those who seem least deserving of it, might just be the gesture that changes everything, for them and for us. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the city outside. Keanu's words seemed to echo in the stillness, pressing on the hearts of everyone present. His calm demeanor, paired with his profound message, had turned what began as a tense and uncomfortable evening into a moment of introspection and transformation. Especially to those who seem undeserving, might just be the gesture that changes everything. The staff remained silent, absorbing his words. Some appeared visibly moved, their expressions softening as they reflected on their behavior. Others stared at the floor, clearly lost in thought and contemplating their own actions. Ashley finally lifted her head, wiping away her tears. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight of remorse. I never thought about it that way before," she admitted, her tone shaky. "I was so focused on the restaurant's image, on maintaining standards, that I forgot what really matters. I forgot that every person has value, no matter who they are or what they look like." Her words hung in the air, the sincerity of her admission resonating with the team. It was clear she was not just apologizing, but beginning to understand the lesson Keanu was sharing. Keanu nodded gently, his expression encouraging but measured. "That realization is a step in the right direction, Ashley," he said. "What's important now is what you do moving forward. Acknowledging your mistake is only the beginning. Change comes from the choices you make every day." Ashley nodded, a mix of determination and regret on her face. The other staff members exchanged glances, the atmosphere shifting as Keanu's message began to take root among them, matter who they are or what they look like. "I promise, Mr. Reeves, I'll change," Ashley said, her voice trembling but filled with sincerity. Keanu nodded, offering her a small, encouraging smile. "That promise is to yourself, Ashley, not to me. True change comes from within, and if you need help along the way, I'll be here." Ashley nodded vigorously, a mix of relief and determination washing over her face. Her tears dried as she straightened her posture, ready to embrace the lesson she had learned. Keanu turned back to address the rest of the staff. "Kindness isn't about grand gestures," he said, his voice steady and resonant. "It's about the small choices we make every day. It's about treating everyone we encounter as if they matter, because they do. And that is what defines the character of a place, and of each of us as individuals." His words carried a quiet but undeniable power, leaving the team and the room in thoughtful silence. Every face reflected a mix of introspection and inspiration as the weight of his message settled in their hearts. And of a person. "Oh, Mr. Reeves, your message was clear," the manager said, his voice filled with conviction. "We'll work to ensure that Lumiere reflects exactly what you envisioned. Thank you for reminding us of that." Keanu simply nodded, offering a serene smile before turning and stepping out of the restaurant. The streets of Beverly Hills sparkled under the glow of the city lights. He paused briefly on the sidewalk, gazing back at Lumiere's entrance. His soft smile returned as he reflected on the events of the evening. What had transpired wasn't just about a restaurant or a mistreated customer. It was about something much deeper. The importance of creating spaces where people feel seen, valued, and respected, no matter who they are or what they look like. Keanu took a deep breath, the crisp night air filling his lungs, and then continued walking down the illuminated street. His mind lingered on the message he hoped others would take from the evening. Kindness, respect, and empathy have the power to transform not just moments, but lives. And in a world often quick to judge, it is those small, compassionate choices that truly define us as human beings. People feel seen, heard, and valued. And Keanu knew that even in the most challenging situations, there was an opportunity to inspire and transform. As he walked down the illuminated streets of Beverly Hills, Keanu reflected on what he had said, and more importantly, the message he hoped others would take from that night. If he could leave everyone who heard the story with one thought, it would be this: in a world where you can be anything, choose to be kind. True strength lies not in judgment, but in acceptance. And above all, remember, it's in the small choices we make every day that we shape not only the world around us, but also who we are as human beings. Keanu continued walking, his calm, thoughtful demeanor unchanged as the city's lights sparkled around him. The night had been more than an uncomfortable confrontation. It had become a reminder of how kindness and respect could leave a lasting impact, even in the most unexpected of places. Day that we shape not only the world around us, but also who we are as human beings. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience. Thank you for being a part of this journey with us.